All right, so in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit more about chapters 3 and going through your goals table for your other project and for the course paper. When coming up with a goals table, the first thing that you need to do is specify what the client's problem is. So I'll show you what the goals table is going to look like. So for your project, you're essentially going to be putting together a sheet that looks like this, and also for one of your homework assignments. So the client's concern is essentially the client's problem. What they're coming in for today, whether it be anger issues, problems with their spouse, problems at work. But it doesn't necessarily say anything about any kind of measurement. So the next column talks about the problem operationally defined, and there's two big components of an operational definition. One of which is the number of times the behavior occurs. So number of drinks, number of arguments, number of cigarettes smoked, but it also has to be within a specified time frame. There's a big difference between number of cigarettes smoked in a 24-hour period versus number of cigarettes smoked per week, right? Same could be said for number of drinks over the weekend versus number of drinks in a 24-hour period. So we have to have the behavior in frequency, but also a specified duration. So I'm just going to pull up another example of what this might look like. So a case example might be if, let's say, John was coming to you because he was suspected of gambling. He did a multidimensional assessment from the DSM-4 TR. And during the assessment, John reveals that he's asked his employer for several cash advances. John also reports spending an average of $150 to $200 a week on gambling. Although John would like to change his behavior, he's confident he can do so, but he's hesitant about whether or not he's ready to change. So even though John's willing to discuss the possibility of his goals and counseling options. So an example of this filled out might be, for a problem operationally defined, would be the amount of money John spends gambling each week. So number of dollars he spends gambling each week. You could also be looking at the number of cash advances he asks for each week. But I would say that the problem operationally defined of number of money he spends each week on gambling is pretty sufficient. So in this scenario, problem operationally defined is that pathological gambling. The multi-dimensional assessment here being done was looking at the DSM. So the DSM tells us all the different dimensions of the problem, really helps us to specify that. And so the big thing that a lot of people struggle with in this course is operational definitions of problem. So again, an operational definition is how you're going to go about measuring the problem. So it includes the client's problem as stated in measurable terms, so number of dollars he spends gambling per week. And this is ultimately the target of the intervention. So everything flows from our operational definition. Again, the whole point of doing this is to put the problem into quantifiable terms. So for some people in this course, when they're going to be doing their course project, they might talk about number of minutes spent exercising per day, number of minutes spent sleeping per night, number of minutes spent studying per day. So it's the quantity or the frequency of the behavior, but also in that specified time range. So step 4 of this all is specifying the verifying sources. So verifying sources can be something like self-report, if somebody's going to report their own behaviors, observations by somebody else, agency records. So as opposed to just relying on one source of income, having a verifying source helps us to triangulate or to have different sources telling us either the same story, but if they're not telling us the same story, then we have to try to figure out that incongruency. So in John's case here, some verifying sources might be his own report, but it could also be his spouse's report. It could also be his employer's report on how many cash advances he's asking for. All right, so now we've got a problem. We know how we're going to measure it, and we know how we can check on to see whether or not we're getting an accurate report. Now we have to try to figure out what we want to do with that problem. So we have to specify what our outcome goals are going to be, who's going to be doing what, to what extent, our intermediate goals, and anything that might help us to facilitate these goals. So let me go back to John's example here. So if we're looking at John's outcome goal, it's to abstain from gambling. But in order to get to the stepping stones of abstaining from gambling, we need to look at some intermediate goals. So an intermediate goal might be to decrease the amount of money he's gambling each week from the previous week. So when we know that he's making progress, we can celebrate that along the way. And then the last box is the intervention that we would use. So an intervention might be weekly cognitive behavioral therapy or group-based therapy. For your project, doing the single system design in itself is somewhat of an intervention, so you can report that. And again, on the bottom we have right here is the assessment that we did. So for him, we use the DSM-4. Our facilitative goal is to increase his motivation to change, because it looked like from the report that he's got some motivation to change, but as a clinician, we might have to just massage that motivation a little bit more. And then if there's no additional comments, then you don't have to write any. All right, so then the final step was to link our intervention to the operationally defined problem. And for this case, we said cognitive behavioral therapy, but there could also be some other interventions that you could use. We're going to be talking about how to look up interventions later on in the semester, but group-based interventions, Gamblers Anonymous, we could come up with a big list. All right, so again, facilitative, intermediate, or outcome goals. So outcome goals is what we're trying to get at the end of the intervention. Facilitative is how we're going to try to foster the intervention's effect, and intermediate is goals that are along the way. So an example of a facilitative goal might be helping the client get transportation to their interview. Having somebody take their rehabs day by day would be an intermediate goal, and the client trying to get secure, safe, affordable housing